Imagine a company so powerful, it didn't just dominate an industry, it built civilizations. In the frozen heart of the Canadian wilderness, one name commanded more respect than the government itself. They owned millions of acres of land. They controlled the flow of massive rivers. They built cities where there was once only rock and muskeg. If you held a newspaper in New York, London, or Tokyo at any point in the mid-20th century, you weren't just holding news, you were holding a piece of an empire. But beneath the ink and the paper lay a dark secret, a financial ticking bomb that would lead to the longest, most brutal bankruptcy in history. A 14-year legal nightmare that turned a global titan into a corporate zombie. This isn't just a story about paper. It's a story of corporate hubris, of men who thought they were bigger than the mountains they mined. It's the story of Abitibi Power and Paper, the company that was too big to fail until it became too broken to save. How does a world leader vanish from the map? And what happens when the very ground you built your empire on starts to swallow you whole? Today, we go behind the headlines to uncover the truth of the longest bankruptcy in history.
To understand the fall, you first have to understand the sheer, terrifying scale of the rise. The name Abitibi comes from the Algonquin language, meaning halfway water. It's the dividing line between the Ottawa Valley and the Arctic-bound Hudson Bay. In the early 1900s, this wasn't just a forest, it was a green gold mine. But the gold wasn't under the dirt, it was the wood. Enter Frank Harris Anson. Anson wasn't a lumberjack, he wasn't a frontiersman. He was an entrepreneur with a background in flour milling, but he had the eyes of a predator. In 1912, while exploring the Abitibi region, he saw something no one else did. He saw the perfect synergy: endless spruce forests for pulp and high-volume waterfalls for power. He realized that if you could harness the water to grind the wood, you didn't just have a mill, you had a machine that printed money. On December 4, 1912, Anson incorporated Abitibi pulp and paper mills. But he knew that to conquer the North, he needed the South's money. Anson's vision was vertical integration on a godlike scale. Abitibi didn't buy wood, they owned the timber rights to millions of acres. They didn't buy electricity, they built the dams. But his most ambitious project wasn't a machine, it was a town. Iroquois Falls. Anson didn't want a shack town. He hired world-class landscape architects to design a garden city in the middle of the bush. He built schools, hospitals, and hockey rinks. He paid his workers well, but there was a catch. The company was the landlord. The company was the grocery store. The company was the law. To be an Abitibi man was a badge of ultimate stability. You were taken care of from cradle to grave. But this paternalism created a dangerous illusion, the idea that the company was immortal. By the 1920s, the world was starving for news. This was the golden age of newsprint. Every major newspaper in the United States was expanding, adding pages, adding Sunday editions. They needed Canadian spruce to fuel the information age. Abitibi didn't just grow, it exploded. They began a phase of aggressive expansion. They bought out rivals like Spanish River Pulp and Paper. They acquired the Fort William Paper Company. By 1927, Abitibi was a behemoth. It was the largest company in Canada by assets. But look closer at the ledgers. This empire wasn't built on profit. It was built on a mountain of debt. Anson and his successors were betting everything, every mill, every town, every worker's future on one single gamble, that the price of paper would never, ever go down. It was a bet they were about to lose in the most catastrophic way possible. Continuing the saga of Abitibi, In Part 2, we move from the golden height of the 1920s into the dark, suffocating reality of the Great Depression and the start of the longest bankruptcy in history. The House of Cards collapses. In the late 1920s, Abitibi Power and Paper was the undisputed king of the North. They were the largest company in Canada by assets. They had a private navy of tugboats, a fleet of trains, and controlled the Abitibi Canyon, a hydroelectric project so massive it was the largest of its kind since Niagara Falls. But behind the scenes, the foundation was rotting. To fund their aggressive expansion, buying up every rival mill in sight, the company's directors didn't use cash. They used debt. Massive bond offerings sold to international investors. They were operating on a philosophy of growth at any cost. The logic was simple. The more mills they owned, the more they controlled the market. If they controlled the market, they could keep newsprint prices high. It was a perfect circle until the world broke. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, it didn't just hit the banks, it hit the breakfast table. As businesses across the globe shuttered, advertising revenue for newspapers evaporated. If there are no ads, you don't need a 60-page Sunday paper, you need 12. Suddenly, the world's hunger for Canadian spruce didn't just slow down, it died. In 1927, newsprint sold for $70 a ton. By 1934, that price had plummeted to $40. For Abitibi, this was a death sentence. Their massive mills were designed for high-volume, 24/7 production. To be profitable, they needed to run at 80 or 90% capacity. By the early 30s, they were running at less than 30%. Imagine owning a Ferrari, but only having enough gas to drive it to the end of your driveway. Now imagine you still have to make the monthly payments on that Ferrari and 10 others just like it. The debt that fueled their rise was now a noose around their neck. On June 1, 1932, the unthinkable happened. Abitibi Power and Paper, the titan of the Toronto Stock Exchange, the employer of tens of thousands, defaulted on its mortgage bond interest payments. They were broke. On September 26th, the company was officially declared insolvent. In any other era, the story might have ended there. The assets would be sold, the workers fired, and the name Abitibi would be a footnote in a history book. But Abitibi was too big to fail. If Abitibi vanished, entire towns like Iroquois Falls would become ghost towns overnight. The provincial economy of Ontario would crater. The government couldn't let it die, but the creditors wouldn't let it live. What followed was a legal stalemate that defied logic. Abitibi entered receivership. For the next 14 years, Abitibi became a corporate zombie. This is the part of the story that sounds like a fever dream. For over a decade, Abitibi was managed not by CEOs or visionaries, but by a court-appointed liquidator. It remains the longest receivership in Canadian history. Imagine working for a company for 14 years, knowing that legally your employer doesn't exist. The company kept operating, the dams kept humming, the trees were still cut, but every cent of profit went into a legal black hole to satisfy creditors who couldn't agree on how to carve up the carcass. Political wars broke out. The premiers of Ontario tried to break the company apart to save the local jobs. The bondholders, mostly wealthy investors from Montreal and New York, fought to keep it whole so they could sell it for a higher price later. It was a 14-year game of financial chicken. The workers were caught in the middle. The garden cities Anson had built began to fray at the edges. The paint peeled. The hospitals grew old. The certainty of the Abitibi man was replaced by a decade of wondering, will the mill be open tomorrow? Ironically, it took a global tragedy to save Abitibi. World War II changed the math. The demand for paper and cellulose for the war effort and the massive post-war economic boom that followed finally pushed newsprint prices back up. By 1946, the zombie finally had a pulse. The company emerged from receivership, restructured and leaner. They had survived the impossible. They had cheated death for 14 years. But as the company stepped into its second life, they made a fatal mistake. They looked at their survival not as a warning, but as a confirmation of their invincibility. They were about to double down on the very things that nearly killed them. We are moving into the era of the paper titans. This is part 3, where Abitibi tries to reclaim its throne, only to realize the throne is made of sand.
The Gilded Rebirth and the Invisible Rival. In 1946, Abitibi Power and Paper didn't just walk out of the grave, they sprinted. For 14 years, they had been a corporate ghost. Now, they were the darlings of the post-war boom. The world was rebuilding, and news was the currency of democracy. Television was in its infancy, but the newspaper was still the king of the living room. Abitibi emerged from receivership with a clean slate and a hunger for dominance. By 1965, they simplified their identity to Abitibi Paper Company Limited. It was a statement of focus. They weren't just a power company anymore. They were the lungs of the global media machine. They began a 20-year run that looked like a miracle. Dividends were high. The mills in northern Ontario were screaming at 100% capacity. The Abitibi man was back, buying cars, sending kids to university, and believing that the spruce forests would provide forever. But behind the prosperity, a new kind of hubris was setting in. In 1974, Abitibi made a move that would define the decade. They didn't just buy a competitor, they bought a legend. They acquired the Price Company, a historic Quebec firm with roots going back to the 1800s. The resulting entity, Abitibi Price, became the largest newsprint producer on the planet. They were the undisputed heavyweight champion. But here's the thing about heavyweights. They are slow, and the world was starting to move very, very fast. While Abitibi Price was busy counting their rolls of paper, 3 invisible threats were converging like a perfect storm. First, the geography trap. For a century, Abitibi's strength was the Canadian spruce. It's slow-growing, dense, and makes the best paper in the world. But in the southern United States, companies were starting to use fast-growing southern pine. It wasn't as high quality, but it was cheap, and it grew 3 times faster. Suddenly, the green gold of Ontario had a cheaper, faster rival in Georgia and Alabama. Second, the environmental bill. For decades, Abitibi had dumped its waste into the rivers and let its smokestacks billow. But in the 70s and 80s, the bill came due. New environmental regulations forced the company to spend hundreds of millions of dollars retrofitting old, decaying mills. It was non-productive capital, money spent just to stay open, not to grow. Third, the silent assassin. In the corner of newsrooms, a new machine was appearing, the computer.
At first, it was just for typesetting, but the digital age was whispers in the hallway. The leaders of Abitibi Price laughed it off. People will always want to hold a newspaper, they said. The feel of the paper, the smell of the ink, that's human nature. It was a fatal misunderstanding of their own product. Abitibi didn't sell paper. They sold a medium for information, and the information was about to find a new home. By 1981, Abitibi Price was so big it looked like a bank, and that's exactly how the Reichman family saw it. The Reichmans, through their company Olympia and York, were real estate titans. They didn't know anything about trees. They didn't know anything about pulp, but they knew Abitibi Price had massive assets, huge land holdings, and steady cash flow. They launched a takeover. This was the turning point. Abitibi was no longer an operator, it was a piece. The company was moved from the hands of papermakers into the hands of real estate speculators and investment bankers. Abitibi was now a gear in a much larger, much more fragile machine. When you are an independent company, you live and die by your product. When you are a subsidiary of a global real estate empire, you live and die by your owner's debt. In the early 90s, the Reichman Empire began to tremble, and as the foundation cracked, Abitibi Price was left dangling over the edge. The 90s were a decade of desperate consolidation. Olympia and York collapsed in a spectacular multi-billion-dollar bankruptcy. Abitibi Price was spun off, drifting like a ship without a rudder. Their solution? Get bigger. In 1997, they merged with Stone Consolidated to become Abitibi Consolidated. They thought that by combining their shrinking markets, they could create a monopoly that could dictate prices, but they were trying to monopolize a dying light. The digital revolution wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar. The internet was here. Classified ads, the lifeblood of newspapers, were moving to Craigslist. News was moving to Yahoo. Abitibi was still building the world's best printing presses in a world that was starting to look at screens. They were 30,000 employees strong, but they were standing on a melting glacier. This brings us to the end game. In Part 4, we witness the Titanic moment, the final desperate mergers that led to the ultimate disappearance of the Abitibi name.
The final merger and the erasure. By the mid-2000s, Abitibi Consolidated was a wounded giant. Its stock price was bleeding, its mills were aging, and the demand for newsprint was falling off a cliff. But instead of pivoting, instead of investing in the digital future or diversifying, the leadership decided to double down one last time. In 2007, Abitibi Consolidated announced a merger with its biggest remaining rival, Bowater. On paper, it looked like a masterstroke. The new company, Abitibi Bowater, would be the third largest forest products company in the world. They thought they were building a fortress. In reality, they were just tying two sinking ships together, hoping that the combined weight would somehow help them float. It was the ultimate act of corporate cannibalism. They were swallowing each other just to stay upright for one more day. Then, the 2008 global financial crisis hit. For Abitibi Bowater, this wasn't just a recession, it was the end of the world. The triple threat we talked about earlier, debt, declining demand, and high operating costs, all converged at once. Newspapers across North America began to fold. Those that survived cut their page counts to the bone. Suddenly, there was a global glut of newsprint that no one wanted. The company was drowning in $6 billion in debt. They were paying hundreds of millions in interest, while their revenue was evaporating. In April 2009, less than 2 years after the great merger, Abitibi Bowater did the only thing it could do. It filed for bankruptcy protection. The Titan had fallen again. When the company finally emerged from bankruptcy in 2011, it was unrecognizable. The creditors had taken control, the old leadership was gone, and most significantly, the name Abitibi, a name that had defined Canadian industry for nearly a century, was deleted. The company rebranded as Resolute Forest Products. It was a cold corporate erasure. The name that once represented halfway water, the name that built Iroquois Falls, the name that once sat at the top of the stock exchange, was gone. Resolute focused on survival. They sold off the grand old mills. They shuttered the historic sites. They diversified into tissue and lumber, finally doing what the old Abitibi refused to do 30 years too late. The era of the Paper King was officially over.
So, what is the real truth behind the longest bankruptcy in history? YouTube experts and business professors will point to the spreadsheets. They'll talk about overexpansion and debt-to-equity ratios, and they aren't wrong. Abitibi failed because it bought too many mills at overvalued prices. It failed because it had no plan B for a world without physical newspapers. But there's a deeper truth. Abitibi failed because of identity. For 100 years, the company didn't just make paper, it was paper. Its entire culture, its towns, and its leaders were built on the belief that the 20th century would never end. They were so busy being the world leader that they forgot to look at the world they were leading. They were a 19th century vision operating in a 21st century reality. Today, the legacy of Abitibi is written in the geography itself. The massive dams they built still hum, providing green energy to the grid. The forests they managed still grow, though under different names. And the towns, Iroquois Falls, Pine Falls, Bay Como, they still stand. But for many of these towns, the silence of the mills is deafening. They are struggling to find a new identity in a post-industrial world, much like the company that gave them life. Abitibi was a titan. It represented the ambition of a young nation trying to conquer its own wilderness. But in the end, it was conquered by the one thing no company can beat: time. The next time you see a newspaper or even a digital screen, remember the halfway water. Remember the company that was too big to fail and the 14-year ghost story that followed. Because in the world of business, the only thing more dangerous than being wrong is being right for too long. If you found this deep dive into corporate history fascinating, make sure to hit that like button. It helps us keep telling these stories. What company do you think is the Abitibi of today? Who is making the same mistakes right now? Let me know in the comments below.